societal inputs tell you what you can be or what you cannot be.
Yeah.
And so girls that do not go into science or technical careers make those decisions based on those stereotypes and based on the prejudices of what a woman can be.
Well, welcome everybody to The Sea Has Many Voices, and I am so excited to have my friend and someone I really admire, Dr. Marga Gual Soler. I love her name. And we're continuing a conversation that we started with Ian on another segment. And Marga, I want to talk about where we started to talk about solutions. The show's about a couple things. It's about the fact that we need to realize that the ocean and humanity share the same fate, and that we need to work together. That's what The Sea Has Many Voices. We want as many voices as possible. And you made that point earlier about cross-disciplinary research, and I totally agree with you. My good friend Jared Diamond and I talk about that a lot, that we have too many specialists, and real breakthroughs come when you're willing to reach over and connect specialists to achieve an outcome. And it sounds so simple that anybody should understand it, but it doesn't happen out there in the world.
Right.
People are so siloed, as you said. And then the other third part of it is, how do we, as a planet, there's 7 to 8 billion people on the planet now, and back at the turn of the early part of the 1900s, I think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it was like 1 billion. We have just really grown fast, right? And it's like we're on a freight train that's going down a mountain, and we're just gaining speed, and at the end the track runs out, and the train falls off the cliff. And we've got to work fast on this, and to work fast on this means talking and collaborating amongst nations, because that's how the planet sociologically organized itself. We humans spread out and moved from a small village environment in Africa. I think we figured there might have been 2,000 of us at one point. And we have that spirit of exploration like you have. You're going down to Antarctica, and we just kept moving around the planet looking for new resources, new interesting things. We were willing to take risks, and we ended up populating the whole planet now, including Antarctica. Antarctica was just in the last century that we have people there 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So it was the last continent. We are, by the way, we are sitting along the coastline in beautiful California. We have the ocean behind us. You'll hear some sounds in the background. That's just life here. So it's, we spread around the planet. I'm just trying to lay this out. And we're the same species. We're all related. And not just related to each other, we're related to the grass. We share
Right.
DNA with grass. I mean, everything on the planet is related to each other through biological evolution. And then we broke ourselves off into tribes, and then the tribes eventually became countries. And now we have, it varies between 170 to 180 countries, I guess, something around there. It's 668. And we've got to somehow get together and talk about how we're going to manage this spaceship that we're on, right? Because we are on a spaceship. We're on a spaceship Earth, traveling 67,000 miles an hour right now around the sun. Everything we ever have, everything we ever will have is here now. And we've got to figure out how to use it.
That's the Carl Sagan.
Carl Sagan and Buckminster Fuller metaphor, which I love.
Yeah.
And we talked earlier in another segment about Antarctica and how it was a continent. A lot of people don't know, but it is a fully fledged continent down there. It's about the size of North America, if you were to stick it up and compare it. The only difference is it's got, 3 or 4 kilometers of ice on top of it, this glacial cap, which is melting in some areas faster than we want. But it's a full continent. It's got oil, it's got coal, it's got a lot of marine resources. And there was a treaty back in 1960?
59.
59, it started an International Geophysical Year, where on the one hand, I studied that, I got my master's in marine policy, and it was on Antarctica. And so it was CAMLR, which was the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. So I studied this quite a bit a long time ago. And one of the reasons that everybody was willing to sign that treaty, which basically said, you know, for those people that haven't heard the other segment, it's this treaty that governs Antarctica says you can't demilitarize, for one thing. There's no military activity allowed. There's no extractive industry allowed. It's only science. And nobody owns it. Everybody owns it. And those principles were able to be, you know, people will they signed that treaty back then because they never imagined they'd ever go there to take anything, for one thing. I don't think the world would sign it today because there are resources there that people want. But back then they figured, oh, nothing to lose. Let's just sign this treaty. And it's worked. You know, it doesn't have any enforcement mechanisms. But, you know, we don't have people violating it at any high level. And it's one place where we do an okay job, I'll say an okay job of managing a big chunk of the earth collaboratively.
Exactly.
And it's a good model. And it's science-based. The language that doesn't lie and the language that, you know, all nations speak. But then there's the Arctic, on the other hand. Can you talk about the Arctic?
Yeah. So many people think that the Arctic is just the opposite of Antarctica, and they could not be more different. So for start, the Arctic is an ocean surrounded by land, right?
Yeah.
And Antarctica is a continent surrounded by ocean. The second difference is that Antarctica did not have any indigenous peoples, as we discussed in the first segment. So it was easy to decide that nobody owned it because it was empty to begin with. So it was much easier for countries to come together and say, let's save this space for science and for international collaboration, because they didn't have to deal with any local communities.
Right.
But the Arctic has indigenous communities, and that really brings a whole new layer that happens not just in the Arctic but in other parts of the world, in how do we deal with our indigenous traditional communities that have been there for a long time before us and know a lot more than we know about the environment and about how to manage it and about solutions. So that's another big difference between Antarctica and the Arctic. And then the obvious, I would say, challenge that we see is that the Arctic is melting. So both poles are melting, but the Arctic is melting. And what that means is very different, because that will open the channel for trade, right? And so the whole geopolitical landscape is built on our trade routes, if you will. That and who has nuclear weapons, which is also related to the Arctic.
Yeah.
And so if you imagine a new Silk Road over the Arctic, with the U.S. And China directly connected, and basically no need for the Panama Canal or other trading routes, that will fundamentally change the entire economy, the supply chains and trade. And also it will probably open up the competition for the resources and fishing and extraction, but also the militarization of the Arctic. And so the Arctic, there's no Arctic treaty that's equivalent to the Antarctic Treaty, but there's an Arctic Council.
Right.
That the Arctic states are, as you say, I think about Antarctica, also it worked out pretty well until now. But what's different is that when the Antarctic Treaty was signed, 1959, as you say, countries did not imagine why they would need it for, or why they would. It was very easy to sign off.
Right.
But now, for instance, China is a polar superpower. And when China signed the Antarctic Treaty, it was not a polar superpower. So now we have China already very strongly leaning towards...
Are they?
Towards both the Arctic, which is more obvious, but also Antarctica. And so in 30 years, the Antarctic Treaty is up for renewal. And there are potentially some parts of the treaty that might not stand with the new world that we are, right? So we have the new science and technology, we have the new geopolitical landscape that's not the same that we had in the 50s. So how do we preserve this achievement for humanity, for the planet, that's protecting an entire continent for science and peace in this 21st century when we have such a different context. And then I think more urgently is how do we manage the Arctic, and how can we both stop the melting from happening, right?
Yeah.
So that would be, I would say, the first line of action. But then if this happens, how do we ensure that the world doesn't fundamentally come into turmoil because of the competition on the Arctic?
Yeah, thank you. That was a very informed overview of very high altitude sort of headlines about it. And I kind of want to summarize it for myself and our listeners that, first of all, having ice is important for this planet. This planet has never been ice-free with humans on it. And it's part of the system that makes the ocean currents. Mm-hmm. It makes the kind of planet that we're comfortable with and that we like. And once the ice goes away or reduces dramatically, and it's melting very fast, everybody. It's melting faster than the models predict in Greenland and on the frozen sea ice on the Arctic. The weather will change, and it's very hard to get that ice back. It doesn't come back quickly. Because one of the issues is that when you have ice, it's white, and that reflects sunlight and heat back out. But when the ice goes away, you have dark water, and it sucks the heat into the ocean. So it's kind of a runaway heating, warming. So we really don't want to lose any more ice, everybody, because it's melting. But the Antarctic Treaty worked, and there's no police officers down there or international sanctions about violating it. It just kind of works. And then on the other hand, now we have this very confused, competitive thing going on in the Arctic. Not only is the ecosystem falling apart as we know it, there'll be another ecosystem. Ecosystems don't go away, they just change. Mm-hmm. And they're already coming up with fishery management plans for fisheries that are not yet open, because they know they're going to open as that ice melts.
Right.
On the Arctic, it's probably it's the polar opposite physically on the planet, but also in terms of success. I think there's a lot of competition over. Everybody wants to extend their exclusive economic zones a little further to get some oil. Everybody's butting heads, and it's not working. So I think there's lessons there for us as a planet, because we've got to get our shit together. I mean, we really do. We've got to. In our other conversation I had, you talked about, collaborating and talking, and I started this little riff about the planet. We organized ourselves into these number of countries, and that's how we operate. We talk to each other, and we make agreements. We try to stick to the agreements. Those countries that have the biggest guns and rocks and industries have more say over things. So there's this geopolitical balance that's corrected with economies and things. But we've got to get it together. We have to focus on what is important and agree to it and then carry through. And that's what the UN's for. And, I know there's a lot of criticism about the UN and that it's a big bureaucracy, it's inefficient, but I always refer back to Winston Churchill, where he said democracy was the worst form of government in the world except for all the rest.
Exactly.
And the UN's probably the worst way to run the world except for all the other options that we have. We don't have any other options. The UN is what we have. Yeah. So we gotta stick to it. And these treaties are the tools of our trade, I would say. The tools of our trade to get along and to make the right decisions on a planetary basis.
And I would say that, to add to that, multilateralism is what has brought us these successes in environmental protection. Because I think realizing that, for instance, is it 60% of the ocean that sits outside of national jurisdictions, right? So it's not that it's nice to work with your neighbor in managing something. In some critical areas like ocean governance, it's imperative. Yeah. Because if not, then you have, if the high seas are not managed collectively, then it becomes just another. It perpetuates the superpower hegemony in which, if this is an empty space, I'll just go and take whatever, because if I have the boats, if I have the capacity to go, and of course it will reinforce the inequality and the division of the global south-north dynamic that we have. So in places like the ocean, I think it's also where we can put a lot of messaging and storytelling, because it's very obvious. Everybody knows that the ocean has things in it that move, that cannot belong to a political boundary. And so it is very, the concept of science diplomacy comes very easy when you talk about air, when you talk about water, things that move, things that are, moving between or across boundaries. And you can't just say, okay, my exclusive economic zone is this distance, and then I cannot confine all of my resources inside, because there is no fence, there is no border. So it's a good, I think, symbol for what we're trying to achieve here. And in that sense, I think the optimistic, and you probably know more about the status, is the new treaty, the BBNJ. Yeah. Right? So how's that because there hadn't been a treaty like that for 20 years or so, right? How is that a breakthrough, and what hope it gives us?
No, Marga is a science diplomat, everybody, and she's mentored me in this area, in the sense that it's what I've been doing my whole life, but I didn't know it until she told me that I'm doing science diplomacy, which is to try to get things done on evidence-based arguments and stay away from politics and religion. And you can make progress if you do that in the international community. And you've just asked about the law of the sea and the high seas. And, things are still happening on the planet in terms of opportunity to keep getting it right. The law of the sea was a very interesting construct that was thought about for a couple of decades, several decades. There were other treaties that kind of led up to it, and then it was signed in the 80s and then ratified in the early 90s, basically. And it was the first draft, but the law of the sea, the final law of the sea, did a really good job at defining who owned what. Mm-hmm. That's basically what the first it did. And then it's a good document. It's a really good document. Then it opens up opportunities for further generations to do the rest of the work. Like, how do you use what you own, and how do you manage what everybody owns? Because there's parts of the ocean that everybody owns, the high seas, and then each nation gets to own 200 miles out from your coast. So every country that borders the ocean has another 200 miles that they own, which is the ocean. They own anything in the water column, and they own anything on the seabed. There are some special provisions that ships can pass through your water. It's called the right of free passage, which is another component of the law of the sea. So it's hard to restrict people from doing that. Mm-hmm. But you own it. It's as good as land. And now there's a work on the high seas, and everybody says that are policy wonks, we call them policy wonks that work on this stuff. The policy wonks say this was the unfinished part of the law of the sea. Mm-hmm. Okay. They kind of left that. They got, okay, we figured out what everybody owns, and then they said, and we're going to put the high seas away. We'll just do that later. Right. And later is now. And it's going to probably come to ground over the next year or two with some clarity over what we do with. Now, for those of the listeners that are good with numbers, think about this. 70% of our planet is ocean, and 60% of the ocean is owned by everybody together. And the question Marga posed to me is, how do you manage that resource that everybody owns, that is also critical to maintaining the life support systems on our spaceship Earth that we live on? And I don't know all the answers, but I do know that we've got to figure out ways for the ocean to regenerate, not just sustain the use of it. That's a big change now. We used to say as long as it was sustainable, it was okay. Well, that's not the case anymore. It should be better on balance for the planet overall when you're done. That's the goal of projects like Drawdown mm-hmm. and Regenesis, or regenerative thinking, so that if you make a building now, it doesn't have any carbon emissions, and maybe the concrete also absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere, so it actually draws down CO2. That's the kind of thinking. And in the ocean, it might mean that if you have some, I'm just making this up on the spot, but let's just say you've got a farm and it's got some organic runoff, organic material that used to go into the ocean and just cause eutrophication. Maybe they consolidate it and feed it to a fish farm next to the terrestrial farm. That would be regenerative or more of an additive use, where you think it through and you don't lose opportunities, and you do some engineering on the problems. So I'm optimistic that we're going to get that right, I hope, and it's a lot of opportunity for any young women out there, and that's another theme that I want to talk to you about. Is we talked about a little bit in the other segment is the opportunities that are opening up now for women, and I'm sure that you're a model, and do you have experiences? Do you have a lot of young women coming to you saying, how do I do what you do? And tell me about that.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. It's really true that I think we're moving towards a place where we won't call women we won't say it's a woman. This is not a woman scientist. This is a scientist, right? And there will be no distinction. I think that's what we need
that's the goal,
to work towards, right? Yeah. And so absolutely, the more I think visibility from role models that we can have especially for young girls. We were talking about this with Christine earlier. Like, there's an age that women or girls, because societal inputs tell you what you can be or what you cannot be.
Yeah.
And so this is in the early teenage years, right? So there's a lot of I think a big part of girls that do not go into science or technical careers make those decisions based on those stereotypes and based on the prejudices of what a woman can be. And so having those examples out there, making them visible, and really first empowering individually girls that you can be what you want, you can be what, all of the mantras, and that you can't be what you can't see. So you have to have the role models out there, so then you can see yourself reflected in them.
You can't be what you can't see.
Exactly.
Like that. Okay.
And so if you first you have the role models, they have to be diverse. So if the role models are diverse, any girl from any background, from any country, will identify with them, right? So we want to have diverse and inclusive leaders, women leaders, that can serve as role models. But then we also have to change what the systemic or structural barriers are. So it's not about individual action. It's really a parallel with climate change in a way that this is something Cristiana Figueres says. And she says, for a long time, we've only used 50% of our talent. So women are 50% of the planet, but we have not included them in the way that, at the level that the potential that we should. And she draws a very interesting parallel with energy and renewable energies. It's like we have this unlimited supply of sun and waves and wind, and we just haven't been using it, right? Mm-hmm. And we choose to use something that will run out versus something that's an unlimited supply. And so she compares renewable energy with the inclusion of women in the decisions that shape our planet. And I think the two connected is really what's at the basis of this Antarctic program that I'm on. And how do we bring more women and their leadership style into the conversation about planetary sustainability and facing the climate crisis?
Who were or who are your heroes? They don't have to be women or men, just heroes. Like you said, it's not a woman, it's a scientist. I'm talking about a hero. I don't care what
exactly. So I've been very inspired by people who were not following traditional paths, right? So my training as a scientist was just regular laboratory molecular biology training. But I felt like that kind of path was, everybody was going through that, and I wanted to be different. Yep. So I've always looked for references, and many of them I'm very lucky to have as mentors, and women, especially women in Latinas and women in science that come from a similar background. So they were the ones that I saw myself reflected. I could probably one day, achieve what they have achieved. And so some of them are not famous as you would see them on TV. Like Francis Colon, who was in the State Department.
They don't have to be famous.
Right.
Yeah.
Mandy Holford, who's a marine biologist that you met in Trieste when we were there. Yeah. We have a picture with her. So these are examples of women who are diverse, who are brilliant, who are breaking ground in their fields. And they have inspired thousands and of women, and I'm one of them. So now I want to think that I am also in that place where
you
a
are.
lot of emerging
it's a responsibility you have now.
women are coming to me, and I feel like that's also the goal of this homeward bound expedition. It's about leadership and about visibility. So if you get the visibility through this high profile platform and high visibility platform, then it's going to be much easier to reach and for others to know that your career can also be their career. And so in a way, I like to think that I'm not following anyone's steps, but the mindset of always trying to look for what's not yet explored is what really brings me here, and what I've seen in the women that I admire and I would call my role models. And so if you ask me a lot of people ask me for career advice, and I'm really not good at that, because career advice sometimes sounds like, oh, I've got it figured out. Here's my 10-year, track or documented process that I can share with you. But actually, a lot of it is really about being entrepreneurial, and it's being about connections. And the fact that we're sitting here today in LA after having, worked together in Washington and in Italy, and these are all connections that you could not design. So there's no, I would say there's no world in which I could design meeting Greg and Christine and then sitting here today in
You're a very smart person.
in LA.
The way your mind puts things together.
Right. And so I think that's the key. When you also, because looking at the science diplomacy conversation, we need more scientists in the diplomacy world. We need more diplomats to understand how science can help them. But there are few people who are sitting at this boundary. So one thing that I would like to do from now on is to find a way to place more people at the boundary. People like you, people like me, people who can speak to the scientific community with authority, because we have PhDs and we have, all the checks that the academic community requires of us to take us seriously.
Even though PhDs aren't all what they're pumped up to be, everybody.
Right. But then we also have reach and access and credibility to the policy and the diplomacy communities, right? So you as a science advisor for a government, you know exactly how to talk about science in a way that it will resonate, because many scientists do not communicate in a way that resonates with the decision makers, and that's this big gap. So you've been very successful in arranging these coalitions to achieve diplomatic outcomes, and I think it comes to positioning yourself at the boundary and knowing how to speak the science language, how to speak the diplomatic language.
I agree with you. There is a boundary. You're right. Yes, I love talking to you. I would learn things about myself talking to you.
This is like a
I know.
Freudian
I'm tired of
exercise.
I'm tired of talking about myself. Let's find out what you think about me. No, the working at the boundary. You're right, and that's what I've done. It's what you do, and you said something earlier. You can't do what you can't see.
Right.
And I'm fascinated at what it is that gets people going in their careers, in their lives for young people. What is it that gets people going? Because I get people coming to me as well, a lot, young people, and it's usually something along the lines of, how do I do what you do?
Right.
That's kind of how it's phrased usually, because what they see is somebody that's out diving in the ocean a lot and writing books and National Geographic articles, and you see me on Shark Week and Discovery Channel or something like that. And I have a little trick question that I ask them that maybe you might want to use too, if you like it enough. I say, have you ever thought about doing anything else? And if they say, yeah, I have thought about being a medical doctor or architect or things, but I want to consider your career too, along with the others. And I said, do one of the others. But if they say, I've never thought about anything else but this, that's the magic answer. I say, you're going to be fine. Do it. You're going to end up doing exactly what I do if that's how you're put together in your head. And that's what it really is. It's about the passion. At least this is how I see it for people. Finding the passion and following your passion. And I see a lot of people, later in their careers regret that they didn't follow their passion. They ended up afraid that they weren't going to make enough money or something, and they ended up someplace else. Right. But if you really want it, and it's all you can think about, It will happen, everybody out there, okay? I guarantee it. If you're a young person thinking about a career in oceanography or science diplomacy, and it's got a fire inside you, and you think about it all the time, 7 days a week, it'll happen for you. To me, that's the biggest driver. And but you also talked about people that were mentored you, and that's another incredibly important thing that I like to see people get, and I feel sorry for people that didn't get it. And I do meet people that never had, because the first time, and a mentor, everybody, is somebody outside your family. It's kind of a prerequisite, because who pays attention to you, or it teaches you, and you suddenly see things in you that you didn't even know were there, because that person sees them, and if they're a great mentor, they draw you out and they develop you. And I've been the luckiest person in the world with mentors. You know, I always like to bring Teddy Tucker into the room. He's like my second father. I met him when I was a teenager, and he was a great treasure diver in Bermuda. And he just passed away 7 years ago. And he taught me more and led me more and gave me more. But he's the reason I went to Antarctica. I was down in Bermuda diving with him, and Bill Hamner, the scientist, was there. And Teddy said, "You got to meet this young man, Bill." And next thing I know, I'm on a boat to Antarctica, and I was like 21. And I've had others, but it's really that, and I like to try to create environments where that can happen for young people.
I completely agree. I think you made a very important point. Is when you were asked when you were 21, you want to go to Antarctica. So that moment when you are presented with an opportunity, being able to recognize it and to catch it and go with it, I think that is the key. So if there's one piece of advice, is that you cannot design the strategy to get somewhere, and if you try to design it too much, then you will miss out on opportunities that come in front of you, but you don't see them.
It's funny you should say that, because one of the things Teddy told me, he said to me, some of the many things he said, "Greg, don't ever say no." He said, if you're asked to anything, say yes first.
Yes.
He said, because if you say no too many times, they'll stop asking.
And that's a good advice also for women, because particularly women tend to have imposter syndrome, and that's sometimes a barrier.
What
right?
is this?
Imposter syndrome.
I don't know what that.
It's this idea that you think that you are not good enough for an opportunity, so you kind of discount yourself first. So if you ask me, do you want to go diving right now? And I, of course, don't have the conditions for, like, I don't have the suit, I don't have maybe my license with me. I would find so many reasons to say, no, Greg, let's do it next year, or, let's find another time. And changing that, kind of frame and saying, yes, what do we need to do? And then you will say, okay, you need a suit, you need a, tank, whatever. And then we'll go and find it and see whether we can put together that, assemble what we need to go diving, instead of saying, oh no, I cannot do that, and then discounting myself from the scenario.
I see.
So in a career perspective is the same thing. So when you are offered, or when there's an opportunity in front of you that you think you're not qualified, you as a woman tend to discount yourself, or list all the reasons why you are not qualified, right? Instead of speaking the one or two things that perhaps you do meet all the criteria, and then trying to build on those.
And there's science around this being a gender thing?
I think yes, but it's of course a societal.
Yeah. It's created by society.
Condition, right? Exactly.
So they studied it, huh?
And then when you do, the research on, the CVs of these two people, one woman, one man, are identical, but they are, assessed differently. And so women are perceived as less competent. So it's not that it comes out of the blue. It's like women have faced barriers for the same job to get the same salaries and all of that. Yeah. And they have systematically been discriminated. So of course that will bring you some doubt. And, after a few times of being perhaps not treated at the same level as an expert, as a, when you're looking for a job, then that kind of gets built in you.
It's you said it's systematic. It's also systemic.
Right.
And I'm still appalled when I see it at times. I was talking to Christine earlier today about a friend and a colleague, a scientist, a woman scientist, and when I discovered what she was getting paid, how much less it was than others, and it was and it was only because she was a woman, and she also happened to have a very youthful kind of way of being. So she comes across like an excited teenager, but she's a very smart PhD researcher, published, and she was paid like half what the men were being paid because of that frame that she fit in. So it's around, and it's still happening. Although we're making progress, and I think you're what's the name of it? It's called Homeward
Bound.
Oh, Homeward Bound. Okay, and we'll make sure that we put material up on that, because you're a nonprofit enterprise and you guys are trying to raise some.
Yeah, it's a fundraising exercise. That's also interesting from the women's leadership perspective. It's every participant, every expeditioner has to fundraise her participation.
Yeah.
And so this is not like a fellowship that you are selected and everything is paid for. But I think the hidden intent in the program that's not been revealed yet to us is that at the end of the 10 years, it's 100 women per year, so we'll have a network of 1,000 women from all over the world. And I think the ability to raise money for yourself is a very important skill. It's a very important exercise, especially when you want to have a political, like if you want to run for office, for instance, right? So this is another gendered issue. So men are good at asking for money for themselves. Like if you are pitching to an investor, you say, hey, I have this idea, it's awesome, I'm awesome, why don't you fund me, right? That's easier for men to do in general. So this is all, of course, a generalization. There would be women that are very comfortable doing it and men who are not comfortable. But in general, you see how, for instance, 95% of venture capital goes to men in Silicon Valley, right? And so this idea of funding, of fundraising for you, it's still more of a barrier for women. Women are good at fundraising for a cause, for a research project, like getting grants. Like there's no problem when the object is external, right? But if you put yourself in front of investor or a panel and say, give me money because I have a good idea and it's awesome.
Oh no, I've seen it in my management career, managing women who were not aggressive about asking me for raises, as the guys are. And I would have to give them raises. Because I kept things in my management regime, gender neutral.
Right.
And they'd always be like embarrassed and say, you're getting a raise, You're supposed to be asking for them, but you're not. For whatever reason, but I'm giving you a raise, So that's key. And you said something earlier, which I'd like to sort of bring us to ground on, where you said you can't do what you can't see. It reminded me of one of the most quotable people in the world, Jacques Cousteau, relative to the ocean. And he said, people only protect what they love, and they only love what they understand. And I've added to that to say, and they only understand what they see. So I think, whether it's visual or if you're vision impaired, you can see it and feel it in other senses. The seeing the ocean or seeing a career path of what you can do are both transformative. So I want to thank you for that philosophy, and I want to thank you so much for what you do. And you've enriched me today as you've enriched me in our work together. And I'll have you back again to finish off some conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg, and the team for having me.